The world knew Ace Frehley as Kiss's Space Ace, the silver-masked guitar hero who made Les Pauls scream and stadiums explode. But in a Los Angeles recording studio in late 1978, something happened that would haunt him for 47 years. 7 songs, 12 reels of master tape, and one decision that would change everything. What disappeared that winter night wasn't just music. It was evidence. Studio 55 on Santa Monica Boulevard had seen its share of rock history, but nothing quite like what was unfolding in the winter of 1978. Kiss was at their commercial peak, fresh off the massive success of their solo albums, and the Dynasty sessions were supposed to cement their dominance into the new decade. Ace Frehley arrived at the studio on December 14th with something he'd been hiding from the rest of the band for months. 12 songs. Not the 2 or 3 that each member traditionally contributed to a Kiss album, but 12 fully formed compositions that represented everything he'd learned, everything he'd become since those early days in the Bronx. The studio logs show Ace booking overnight sessions, paying out of his own pocket, bringing in session musicians without telling Gene Simmons or Paul Stanley. Eddie Kramer, who'd engineered some of the band's biggest albums, later recalled those nights with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Ace would arrive around midnight, when the rest of Kiss had gone home, and work until dawn. The guitar tones he was crafting were different from anything Kiss had done before. Darker, more complex, with layered harmonies that showed he'd been studying not just rock, but jazz fusion, progressive rock, even classical composition. His Les Paul Custom, that iconic silver guitar that had become as much a part of his identity as the Space Ace makeup, was running through a new rig he'd assembled specifically for these sessions. Marshall amps, yes, but also a Roland Jazz chorus for clean tones, a collection of vintage Fender effects, and a custom-built preamp that gave his sound a dimensional quality no one had heard before. The session musicians he'd hired, most of whom had worked with Steely Dan and other studio perfectionists, were shocked by Ace's precision. This wasn't the sloppy, drug-addled guitarist the music press had started portraying. This was a craftsman who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. The master tapes were labeled in Ace's handwriting, each song title revealing a depth that contradicted his Space Ace persona. Fractured Mirror was an instrumental that showcased his classical influences, built around a Bach-inspired progression that somehow maintained a rock edge. City Lights Burning was a ballad about isolation and fame, with lyrics that cut too close to his real feelings about Kiss's overwhelming success. Torpedo Girl had the potential to be a massive hit, with a chorus catchier than anything on the Alive albums and a guitar solo that quoted Django Reinhardt before, exploding into pure rock fury. But it was The Bronx Doesn't Forget that really showed what Ace was capable of when given creative freedom. An 8-minute epic that started with acoustic guitar and built through multiple movements, telling the story of his childhood, his father's disappointment, his escape into music, and the cost of fame. The middle section featured a guitar dialogue between his acoustic and electric guitars, representing the conversation between who he was and who he'd become. Eddie Kramer recorded Ace playing both parts simultaneously, using a complex stereo miking setup that captured every nuance. Silver Descent was Ace's commentary on the Space Ace character itself, a hard-driving rocker that used the space theme as metaphor for artistic isolation. Tomorrow's Gonna Hurt predicted his future struggles with addiction, written during a brief moment of clarity about where his lifestyle was heading. Shock Treatment. Part 2 was meant to be a sequel to his Dynasty contribution, Shock Me, but went darker, exploring the electricity metaphor as destructive force rather than creative power. The final 2 songs, Ghost in the Machine and Reflections in Chrome were instrumentals that showed Ace's range. The former was experimental, using guitar feedback and studio effects to create an almost avant-garde soundscape. The latter was pure beauty, a melodic piece that could have been the eruption of its time, a showcase that would have redefined what people expected from rock guitar. If you're watching this, you already know that rock history is built on what almost happened as much as what did. Subscribe to this channel, because what comes next in this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about Kiss, about artistic control, and about how the music industry really works behind the platinum records and pyrotechnics. The playback session, January 1979. The confrontation happened on January 23, 1979. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had known Ace was working on extra material, but they assumed it was sketches, ideas, maybe one or two songs that might make the album. When Eddie Kramer played them the 12 finished masters, the temperature in Studio 55's control room dropped. The studio logs show they were there for 4 hours, listening to every song twice. No one spoke much during the playback. Paul took notes. Gene stared at the tape machine, watching the reels turn. Years later, in a radio interview most people missed, Eddie Kramer described the atmosphere as funeral. Not because the songs were bad, because they were extraordinary. Because they proved something that everyone in that room understood, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Ace Frehley didn't need Kiss. These songs were better than anything the band had done collectively in years. They were personal, innovative, technically brilliant, and commercially viable. Every single one of them could have been a hit, and that was the problem. Paul Stanley spoke first. The studio logs don't record what was said, but Anton Fig, the session drummer who'd played on several of Ace's tracks, was setting up his kit in the live room and heard everything through the monitors. Paul's voice was calm, measured, but had an edge that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. "We can't use these." Gene added something about maintaining the band dynamic and not overshadowing the group identity. Ace, who'd been chain-smoking Marlboros throughout the playback, finally responded. His voice was quiet, tired. "You mean they're too good?" The argument that followed lasted another 2 hours. Ace pointing out that he'd delivered exactly what was needed, 12 strong songs to choose from for his Dynasty contributions. Paul countering that allowing Ace to dominate the album would destroy the balance they'd carefully maintained. Gene, always the businessman, approaching it from a different angle, suggesting that this much quality material from one member would create expectations they couldn't maintain on future albums. The subtext was clear. If Ace could do this, what did Kiss need Gene and Paul for? By the time the sun came up on January 24th, a decision had been made. 2 songs would make the Dynasty album. Fractured Mirror and one other track, to be decided later. The rest would be archived. For possible future use, according to the official studio documentation. But everyone in that room knew what archived meant in the music industry. Shelved, buried, forgotten. Ace fought it, but he was alone in the battle. Peter Criss, who might have been his ally, was already on his way out of the band, dealing with his own issues. The session musicians had no say. Eddie Kramer, despite his respect for the material, was an employee, and Gene and Paul had the power, the partnership agreement, the voting majority. Democracy in Kiss had always been an illusion, but this was the moment that illusion completely shattered for Ace. What makes this story even more painful is understanding why it happened. This wasn't about quality. Everyone agreed the songs were exceptional. It wasn't even about ego, though that played a part. It was about control and fear. Kiss had built an empire on the concept of 4 equal members, each with their defined role, each contributing their piece to the larger machine. Ace's solo album success had already disrupted that balance. These Dynasty songs would have destroyed it completely. But there's another layer to this decision that only became clear decades later. Gene Simmons was working on his own material for Dynasty, songs he considered some of his best work. Paul Stanley had written what he thought would be the album's centerpiece. If Ace's 12 songs were as good as they sounded, if even half of them made the final cut, Dynasty would be remembered as Ace Frehley's album. And for Gene and Paul, who'd founded the band, who'd created the concept, who'd fought to make Kiss a global phenomenon, that was unacceptable. The irony is devastating. Dynasty, released in May 1979, was Kiss's worst-reviewed album to that point. Critics called it overproduced, soulless, a disco-influenced sellout that betrayed everything the band stood for. The 2 Ace songs that made it, Hard Times, and a neutered version of Shock Treatment Part 2, retitled 2000 Man, were critically praised as the only authentic rock moments on the record. Music journalists, without knowing the full story, intuited that Ace had more to offer than what made the final cut. But by then, the master tapes were locked away, and the story of their existence was known only to a handful of people who'd signed non-disclosure agreements. For 46 years, those 7 songs existed in a legal and physical limbo. The master tapes sat in a climate-controlled vault owned by Kiss's parent company, cataloged but untouched. Ace left Kiss in 1982, came back for reunion tours in the 90s and 2000s, left again, and through all of it, never publicly mentioned the Dynasty recordings. When asked about his contributions to that album, he'd give vague answers about creative differences and band politics, but never the full story. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, in their various books and interviews over the decades, presented Dynasty as a challenging but ultimately successful period. They talked about streamlining the creative process, about making tough decisions for the good of the band. They never mentioned Ace's 12 songs. The few people who knew about them, bound by NDAs and music industry omerta, stayed silent. Until recently, the entire incident existed only in rumors, whispered stories among session musicians, occasional cryptic comments in guitar magazines. But Ace never forgot. In interviews from the 2000s and 2010s, careful listeners could hear him allude to it, talking about songs that never saw light, about my best work being locked away, about the price of being in a democracy that wasn't democratic. His solo albums from this era, particularly Anomaly and Space Invader, contained songs that seemed to reference the Dynasty sessions. Fractured 2 was clearly related to Fractured Mirror. Pain in the Neck had musical phrases that matched descriptions of The Bronx Doesn't Forget. Anton Fig, the drummer who'd been there that night, broke his NDA in 2018 during an obscure podcast interview that got little attention at the time. He described the playback session, the quality of the recordings, the tension in the control room. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Those songs would have changed rock history. Not Kiss history, rock history. Because they proved that the guys behind the makeup weren't cartoon characters. They were artists, and that scared some people." It started with an estate sale. Not Ace's estate, not anyone from Kiss, but Eddie Kramer's former assistant, a man named Robert Chen who'd worked at Studio 55 from 1977 to 1981. Chen passed away in January 2025, and his family, liquidating his possessions, found boxes of recording ephemera in his garage. Among the tapes, notes, and studio documentation was something extraordinary. Safety copies of the Dynasty sessions, not the master tapes. Those remained locked away. But the two-track reference mixes Eddie Kramer had made for his own use. Copies that should have been destroyed, but somehow survived. Chen's widow, who knew nothing about their significance, listed them in an online auction with other studio memorabilia. The listing described them as Kiss Dynasty Outtakes 1979, 7 songs never released. It got 90 views in 3 days before a collector in Sweden recognized what he was seeing and bought them immediately for $6,000, a fraction of their actual value. The buyer, whose name hasn't been publicly released, digitized the tapes and shared low-quality snippets on a Kiss fan forum. Within hours, the music community exploded. Even in compressed MP3 format, even through the degradation of 46-year-old analog tape, the quality was undeniable. The guitar tones were pristine. The compositions were sophisticated. This wasn't rough demos or sketches. These were finished, professional recordings that belonged on a major label release. Ace Frehley, now 74 years old, was contacted by the collector through intermediaries. In March 2025, sitting in his home studio in California, Ace heard those songs for the first time in 46 years. His longtime manager described him listening in silence, tears running down his face, occasionally pausing to replay sections. When asked for comment, Ace released a brief statement. "I always knew they were good. I didn't realize they were this good. Time gives you perspective. These songs represent who I wanted to be before I understood the cost of wanting." With the recordings now public, music critics and producers have been analyzing what makes these tracks so special. Fractured Mirror, the instrumental that did make Dynasty, is considered one of Kiss's best deep cuts. But the full version on these tapes is 90 seconds longer, with an additional guitar solo section that showcases Ace's classical training. The edited version sounds incomplete by comparison, a sketch rather than a finished painting. City Lights Burning is perhaps the most devastating song in the collection. Built around a minor key progression and featuring Ace's only extended vocal performance in the recordings, it's a ballad about fame's isolation. The lyrics describe looking out from a hotel room at a city celebrating your success while you feel completely alone. It's personal in a way Kiss rarely allowed, vulnerable in a way that contradicts the Space Ace character completely. Producers who've analyzed the track point out its commercial potential, how it could have been as big as Beth or bigger if anyone had been willing to let Ace show that vulnerability publicly. Torpedo Girl, ironically, is pure commercial rock, the kind of song that should have been a massive radio hit. Fast, catchy, with a chorus built for stadium sing-alongs and a guitar riff that gets stuck in your head after one listen. The Django Reinhardt quote in the solo is subtle, just 2 bars, but it shows Ace's sophistication. He wasn't just copying blues licks. He was building on jazz vocabulary, bringing gypsy jazz phrasing into hard rock in a way no one else was doing in 1979. The Bronx Doesn't Forget is the centerpiece, the song that proves these weren't just good tracks, but important tracks. The 8-minute runtime would have been commercial suicide on Dynasty, admittedly. But as an album-closing track, or split across 2 sides of vinyl, it could have been Kiss's Stairway to Heaven, their statement of artistic ambition. The guitar dialogue in the middle section is technically brilliant, but it's the emotional content that makes it powerful. You can hear Ace's entire life story in those notes. His relationship with his father, his escape into music, his conflicted feelings about success. The 3 remaining songs, Silver Descent, Tomorrow's Gonna Hurt, and the two instrumentals round out what would have been an extraordinary body of work. Music historians have started discussing these tracks in the context of 1979 rock, comparing them favorably to Led Zeppelin's In Through the Outdoor, Pink Floyd's The Wall, and other ambitious albums from that era. The consensus is emerging that if these songs had been released, Ace Frehley would be remembered differently, not as the troubled, talented guitarist who couldn't handle fame, but as a serious artist who was suppressed by his own band's insecurity. As of April 2025, there's an ongoing legal dispute about the recordings. Kiss's parent company claims ownership of all Dynasty session material, including the safety copies. Ace Frehley's legal team argues that since these recordings never became official Kiss releases, rights should revert to the composer. The Swedish collector who bought the tapes has been served with a cease and desist, but claims he legally purchased property that was publicly auctioned. Gene Simmons released a statement through his lawyer calling the situation unfortunate and claiming the songs were rejected for artistic reasons, not politics. Paul Stanley has been silent, though sources close to him suggest he's privately urged the parent company to settle with Ace and allow an official release. Peter Criss, still estranged from the rest of Kiss, gave an interview supporting Ace's position, saying, "I wasn't there, but I know how they operated. If Paul and Gene buried those songs, it's because they were scared. Scared of Ace being too good." The case is complicated by the fact that some of the session musicians, including Anton Fig, have also claimed they should receive royalties if the songs are commercially released. Eddie Kramer, still working as a producer at 80 years old, has offered to remaster the tracks if an agreement can be reached. The recordings that exist are reference mixes, 2-track stereo bounces from the original multi-track masters. Those masters, with their individual instrument tracks, remain in the vault, and their location has become part of the legal discovery process. The existence of these recordings forces a re-evaluation of Kiss's history and Ace Frehley's role in it. For decades, the narrative was that Ace was the wild card, the talented but unreliable member who couldn't meet professional standards. These songs prove that narrative was, at minimum, incomplete. At maximum, it was a deliberate misrepresentation designed to justify marginalizing him within the band. Music critics have started discussing the Dynasty sessions as a pivotal moment in rock history, comparing it to other instances where great material was suppressed for political reasons. The Beach Boys' Smile, the Beatles' Get Back sessions before they became Let It Be, Prince's vault of unreleased material. But this case is different, because the suppression wasn't about artistic uncertainty or creative block. It was about power dynamics within a supposedly democratic band structure. The recordings also raise questions about how many other great albums were prevented from existing by similar politics. How much music has been lost not because it wasn't good enough, but because it was too good. Because it threatened someone's position. Because it would have shifted the balance of power in ways certain people couldn't accept. The music industry's history is written by those who controlled the releases. These tapes remind us that there's another history, the one locked in vaults and lost to estate sales, that might tell a very different story. In a rare extended interview conducted in May 2025, Ace Frehley spoke about the Dynasty sessions for the first time without legal restrictions. Sitting in his home studio, surrounded by his collection of Les Pauls and vintage amps, he was reflective rather than angry. "I was young. I thought if I just made great music, that would be enough. I didn't understand the business yet. Didn't understand that in a band, being too good can be as dangerous as not being good enough. Maybe more dangerous." He talked about the night of the playback session, the moment he realized his bandmates weren't happy about what he'd created. I saw it in Paul's face. He knew. We all knew. Those songs were better than anything we'd done as a band, and that meant they couldn't be Kiss songs, because Kiss was supposed to be about the collective, the four characters. If one of us stepped too far forward, the whole thing fell apart. Asked if he regrets not fighting harder, Ace paused for a long time before answering. Fighting how? They had the votes. They had the lawyers. They had the partnership structure that gave them final say. I could have quit, but then what? Solo career in 1979? Without the Kiss platform, I would have been done. So I stayed and watched those songs disappear, and part of me disappeared with them. But he also expressed something unexpected: gratitude. Those songs had to wait. In 1979, people would have heard them as Kiss tracks, Ace Frehley contributions to a Dynasty album that everyone remembers as Disco Kiss. Now they're hearing them as Ace Frehley songs, separate from the band, evaluated on their own merit. Maybe this is better. Maybe they needed to be found this way, 46 years later, when they can be understood for what they really are. Not rebellion, not ego, just art. As of June 2025, negotiations continue. There's talk of an official release, a special album collecting all 12 songs from those sessions, properly remastered from the original multi-tracks if the vault can be accessed. Ace has suggested bringing in modern producers to enhance the recordings while maintaining their 1979 character. Gene and Paul, facing public pressure and the reality that their version of events is being questioned, seem to be softening their position. If it happens, if these songs finally get the official release they deserved in 1979, it will be one of rock history's most remarkable resurrections. But even if the legal issues prevent commercial release, the recordings are out there now. People have heard them. Music critics have analyzed them. The narrative has changed. Ace Frehley, at 74, has finally been vindicated not through argument or accusation, but through the simple power of letting the music speak. Standing in his studio, Ace picked up that same silver Les Paul Custom, the one he used on those 1978 sessions, and played a few bars from The Bronx Doesn't Forget. His fingers, weathered but still precise, found the notes effortlessly. 46 years, he said quietly. But the guitar remembers. I remember, and now everyone else knows too. That has to count for something. The studio fell silent except for the slight hum of his amps, that distinctive martial tone that defined a generation of rock music. Outside, Los Angeles traffic moved through another sunset, the city lights starting to burn against the darkening sky. Somewhere in a vault, 12 reels of master tape waited, their secrets no longer secret, their suppression no longer effective. The music had survived. Despite the politics, despite the fear, despite 4 decades of silence, the art had survived. And in the end, maybe that's the only thing that matters. Ace set down his guitar and smiled, a tired but genuine smile. They thought they could bury it, he said. But you can't bury the truth. Not forever. Music doesn't work that way. It waits. It's patient. And eventually, one way or another, it finds its way out. In the control room, the master console sat dormant, its faders and knobs still marked with tape labels from countless sessions. On one channel strip, barely visible, someone had written in faded Sharpie, Ace Dynasty Extras. A reminder from 1979, a note from a time when these songs were just shelved material, not a historical discovery, not evidence, not vindication, just music that wasn't allowed to be heard. But now it has been heard. The reels have stopped turning in the vault, but their contents echo through streaming services and music forums, analyzed by new generations who never saw Kiss in makeup, but understand the universal story these recordings tell. A story about art versus commerce, individual vision versus group dynamics, the cost of being too good when mediocrity is safer. The Dynasty sessions are no longer lost. They're found, and with them, a piece of Ace Frehley's legacy has been restored, not through reunion tours or interview justifications, but through the simple, undeniable power of 7 songs that were too good to be released in 1979 but perfect for discovery in 2025.